In the 1960s, the American oil company Chevron, operating under the Texaco brand, entered into a contract with Ecuador's government to extract oil from the basin of the Amazon rainforest. Over the course of the next 26 years, Chevron extracted billions of gallons of crude oil that generated huge revenues for the company. In the process, this large oil company committed one of the worst acts of environmental abuse in history. On the west coast of South America, straddling the equator from which it derives its name, lies the country of Ecuador. Slightly smaller than the state of Nevada, it is home to both the Galapagos Islands and the rainforests of the Amazon. In spite of its relatively small size, Ecuador is home to a vast array of animal and plant species. So much so that Ecuador has been named by Conservation International one of only 17 megadiverse countries in the world, a group of countries that harbor the majority of the Earth's species. Ecuador is also home to a number of native indigenous groups, including the Azucar, Secoya, and Cofan nationalities. These people live off the land. They drink water from the rivers and use them for fishing, bathing, and cooking. And now, thanks to Chevron, they are sick and dying for doing so. To understand how Chevron caused things to go so horribly wrong in Ecuador, we must first take a look at what steps are normally taken to protect the environment when drilling for oil. Oil extraction typically begins when a well is drilled, and pits are created for the temporary storage of oil waste. The pits are lined with industrial tarp, which acts as a highly resistant membrane with puncture and tear resistance designed for heavy weight, liquid, and extreme temperatures. The tarp prevents oil waste toxins from seeping into the ground. While extracting crude oil, the drilling muds, toxic oil waste, and chemical lubricants are stored in the lined pits. In the separation station, crude oil is refined, and the remaining toxic water, what in the oil industry is known as produced water, is re-injected into the ground. When the drilling is complete, the oil sludge is disposed of and the pit is refilled, restoring the site to its natural state. This is the process Chevron and other oil companies generally followed when extracting oil in the United States. Much of the industry had used these drilling and waste disposal practices for years before Chevron entered Ecuador. In fact, in 1962, the American Petroleum Institute published a manual describing the proper re-injection of produced water into the ground. The manual stated, among other things, that extreme care must be exercised in the handling and disposal of produced water, and warning of possible seepage into nearby surface water sources or onto lands used for farming and grazing. Texaco itself had even patented a new technique for re-injection which addressed the problem of pollutants seeping into groundwater. Because Chevron knew that to not do so would cause considerable pollution problems. And in the United States, they followed these standards, but not in Ecuador. Here is what Chevron did in the Ecuadorian Amazon, one of the most fragile and biodiverse ecosystems in the world that is home to 5 indigenous groups. Chevron chose not to re-inject toxic produced water into the ground. Instead, the company installed pipes to drain the toxic wastewater into rivers and streams. And Chevron chose not to line its waste pits the way it had done in the United States, allowing toxins to seep into the soils and contaminate groundwater often relied on by local inhabitants for their drinking water. And rather than properly dispose of the toxic sludge in the unlined pits, Chevron chose to leave it there. The company installed pipes to transport the sludge and contaminated rainwater into nearby streams. Rather than capture the toxic natural gas during extraction, Chevron burned off the gases, a process known as flaring, producing huge flames and releasing dioxins into the environment. This blatant pollution and destruction took place right in the backyards of the indigenous peoples of Ecuador. The damage done by Chevron is evident and widespread, with hundreds of wells and toxic pits spread out over an area of 1,500 square miles, roughly the size of the U.S. state of Rhode Island. Chevron's own top legal official in Ecuador estimated the company dumped more than 16 billion gallons of toxic waste into the Amazon. Independent studies estimate more than 18 billion gallons of toxic waste were dumped. All of this while the indigenous peoples of Ecuador continued to use rivers and streams for their drinking water, bathing, and fishing, the same rivers and streams into which Chevron dumped its toxic waste. Chevron officials even had the audacity to tell concerned village elders that the oil in the water was full of vitamins and minerals. This couldn't be further from the truth. Petroleum hydrocarbons found in the soils and water in Ecuador are known to cause a vast array of diseases and ailments, including liver damage, nervous system damage, spontaneous miscarriages, cancer, and even death. Laboratory studies have confirmed extremely high levels of toxins in the soils in Ecuador's Amazon, some as high as 10,000 times over the maximum tolerances allowed by regulatory authorities in the United States. In several independent health evaluations, including one conducted in the village of San Carlos, cancer rates were up to 30 times higher than normal, and the incidence of childhood leukemia was found to have reached alarming levels. One analysis of health and population data found that more than 9,000 people in the area of Chevron's operations are going to contract cancer in the coming decades, even assuming Chevron undertakes an immediate and comprehensive remediation. This is the real human impact of exposure to oil contamination. The public health catastrophe resulting from Chevron's environmental destruction easily could have been avoided if Chevron had lined the pits and re-injected toxic wastewater as required by the law and industry standards. Why then did Chevron choose to use substandard operational practices in the delicate rainforest environment of Ecuador? Because what Texaco and Chevron have always cared about most in Ecuador is protecting their profits, even at the expense of the indigenous groups and delicate ecosystem. And they thought they would never get caught. Its contract with Ecuador's government required Chevron to use modern technology and operate with care towards the environment. Beyond Chevron's moral and ethical obligations to extract oil in a safe manner, it was legally bound to do so. Shockingly, Chevron all but admitted that it was harming the environment by directing its employees to hide evidence of oil spills and instructing them to destroy any records of existing spills. After decades of environmental destruction and what essentially amounts to the wholesale decimation of indigenous peoples of Ecuador, in 1993 inhabitants of dozens of communities collectively known as Los Afectados, or the Affected Ones, filed a lawsuit to force Chevron to take responsibility for its disaster. As part of its game to avoid accountability, Chevron fought for 9 years to move the litigation from U.S. federal court in New York to Ecuador. It heaped praise on the fairness of Ecuador's courts and argued that they were perfectly capable of determining if the company should be held legally liable for its toxic dumping.
This matter belongs in Ecuador.
Chevron's lawyers and experts filed no less than 14 sworn affidavits in U.S. federal court praising the fairness and transparency of Ecuador's judicial system. Shortly after the lawsuit was filed, Chevron struck a deal with Ecuador's government to spend $40 million to cosmetically treat a small fraction of its 916 waste pits by covering them with dirt, without removing the toxins which to this day continue to contaminate soils and groundwater. The amount spent was less than 1% of the cost of a comprehensive cleanup, according to estimates from the rainforest communities. By comparison, BP committed $20 billion for cleanup and compensation after the much smaller Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico. And Chevron's remediation contract with Ecuador's government did not require it to install technology to re-inject the billions of gallons of toxic wastewater that continued to be discharged into the Amazon waterways. All the while, Chevron made promises to Ecuador's government and its people that its so-called remediation was effective. But Chevron's promises simply collapse in the face of the evidence. Chevron used a bogus laboratory test called the TCLP to quote-unquote prove that it had actually cleaned up its contamination. Chevron knew that the TCLP test captures only a tiny fraction of oil field contamination. Quite simply, Chevron's remediation has been widely condemned as a fraud. Chevron exposed the people of Ecuador to contamination far beyond acceptable levels under either U.S. or Ecuadorian law. According to Chevron, an oil company should be allowed to discharge petroleum hydrocarbons in Ecuador at 100 times the level allowed in most states in the U.S. Chevron has never explained why the people of Ecuador should be exposed to far higher levels of oil pollution than its own employees living near company headquarters in California. After years of Chevron's delay tactics and obstruction, an Ecuadorian court in 2011 found Chevron liable and ordered it pay $18 billion for a cleanup and to compensate the affected rainforest communities. The court also found that 16 billion gallons of produced water had been dumped into Amazon waterways, and that Chevron failed to clean up its unlined oil waste pits. But Chevron has stripped its assets from Ecuador and has announced that it will not pay the judgment. It is doing everything in its power to avoid responsibility. Rather than fix its toxic mess, Chevron launched a greenwashing advertising campaign that claims the company cares about the communities in which it operates. But the truth is that Chevron cares far more about its image than it does about the dozens of communities in Ecuador that continue to suffer from its reckless operational practices. Chevron is paying millions of dollars to lobbyists to pressure the U.S. government to cut trade preferences for Ecuador so that the country will be punished for letting its citizens bring a lawsuit against the company. In one quarter alone, Chevron paid lobbyists over $5 million. That's about 13% of the total amount Chevron spent on its fraudulent remediation. Chevron is more interested in throwing around its political weight than in doing the right thing. This is perhaps most evident in Chevron's reaction to the fact that Ecuador's independent courts actually began to conduct a trial that included extensive scientific evidence. And once Chevron realized that the evidence pointed to its guilt, it suddenly began attacking Ecuador's courts as biased and unfair. The very same courts that Chevron had praised in the U.S. and had asked to decide the claims of the indigenous groups. Why did Chevron keep flip-flopping? In a recent 60 Minutes interview, Chevron attorney Sylvia Garrigo made it clear.
You wanted to go to Ecuador.
We didn't want to get sued,
Now you say
period.
you don't want to be in Ecuador.
No.
What court do you want to be in?
We don't want to be in any court, much less a court with respect to this kind of a claim, which we consider frivolous.
Chevron has paid experts to manufacture so-called proof that there is no increased risk of cancer in the area where it operated. The company has publicly attacked the independent scientists whose studies exposed the human impacts of the pollution. The international scientific community has opposed Chevron's scare tactics and distortion of the evidence. Chevron also used corporate spies such as this man, Diego Borja, to try and bribe an Ecuadorian judge on tape. Borja was caught and his attempt failed. Borja says that he has information that incriminates Chevron, but Chevron quickly moved him from Ecuador to an undisclosed location in the U.S., where the oil company pays him a salary while he does no work. Helping Borja in the entrapment scheme was the American Wayne Hansen, a convicted drug trafficker who vanished from the United States shortly after he was subpoenaed under federal court order. In a devastating email, Hansen threatened to expose Chevron's corruption of the Ecuador court process if the company did not pay him. He was last seen living in Peru. Chevron also pressured a military official in Ecuador, Manuel Bravo, to write a fraudulent intelligence report that was used to block a court inspection of one of the company's most notorious toxic waste sites. In an effort to enlist the United States government in its campaign to sabotage the case, Chevron has paid numerous lobbyists to exert pressure on Ecuador's president to violate his country's constitution and squash the lawsuit. If Chevron succeeds in cutting U.S. trade preferences to Ecuador, the country would lose an estimated 300,000 jobs. 26 members of Congress successfully convinced U.S. trade officials to ignore these demands. While Chevron is spending millions of dollars to evade its responsibilities, it continues to attack the leaders of the Ecuadorian communities and almost anyone who advocates on their behalf. So now that Chevron broke the rainforest in Ecuador, what is it going to do to fix it? To this day, Chevron continues to claim it bears no responsibility for the destruction and deaths its operational practices have caused. Numerous soil samples taken from Chevron's well sites still show they contain high levels of cancer-causing toxins. Meanwhile, the people of Ecuador's Amazon rainforest continue to drink poisoned water and bathe, fish, and wash in streams and rivers that are filled with oil hydrocarbons. For more information, go to www.chevron.com.